And I felt horrible for ever having been self-destructive or self-pitying.
Do you remember when Angelina Jolie didn't just walk into a room? She took control of it without saying a word. There was a time when Hollywood didn't quite know what to do with her. She wasn't the safe choice. She wasn't the predictable star, and that was exactly what made her impossible to ignore. From the very beginning, there was something different about the way she carried herself. The intensity in her eyes, the way she spoke, the choices she made on screen, it all felt like it came from somewhere deeper than acting. Audiences didn't just watch her, they studied her, they tried to understand her. But the truth is, even now, most people only know the version of Angelina Jolie that was carefully shown to them. The humanitarian, the director, the composed public figure who seems to have moved far beyond the chaos of her earlier years. But that version didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was built, slowly, through moments that were as complicated as they were defining. And behind many of those moments, there were men, not just relationships that made headlines, but individuals who shaped the direction of her life in ways the public never fully saw. Some brought out the most intense versions of her. Some forced her to walk away when everything was at stake. And some left behind questions that were never completely answered. If you follow the timeline closely, a pattern begins to emerge. Every major shift, every reinvention, every moment when Angelina Jolie seemed to become someone new, it was never random. It was connected. And once you start seeing those connections, it becomes harder to believe that any of it was accidental. Because by the time we reach the final name on this list, you may begin to wonder if Angelina Jolie was ever truly escaping these influences, or if they were quietly shaping her all along. Born on the 4th of June, 1975, in Los Angeles, Angelina Jolie entered the world with a name that already carried weight. As the daughter of Jon Voight, an Academy Award-winning actor, she was surrounded by the industry from the very beginning. But what looked like privilege from the outside often felt very different on the inside. Her early years were marked less by stability and more by distance, particularly in her relationship with her father. A dynamic that would quietly shape how she connected with people later in life. By the time she stepped into acting in the mid-1990s, she wasn't trying to follow a traditional path. Her performances in films like Gia in 1998 and Girl Interrupted in 1999 didn't just introduce her to audiences, they revealed something raw, something unpredictable. When she won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress, it didn't feel like the arrival of a typical star. It felt like Hollywood had just witnessed someone who didn't intend to fit into its expectations. Then came 2001, and everything changed again. With Lara Croft Tomb Raider, Angelina Jolie became a global icon almost overnight. The image was powerful, confident, and impossible to ignore. But while her career was accelerating, her personal life was becoming increasingly complex. Relationships moved quickly, emotions ran deep, and the line between private and public life became thinner with every headline. What made Angelina different wasn't just the role she chose, but the way her life seemed to mirror the intensity of those roles. One moment, she was the rebellious outsider. The next, a global superstar. Then, a humanitarian traveling across continents, stepping into a role that seemed completely removed from the chaos that once defined her. And yet, when you look closer, those versions don't replace each other. They overlap. They build on top of one another. And behind many of those transitions, there were people who influenced not just what she did, but who she became. Because Angelina Jolie's story isn't just about fame or talent, it's about transformation. And transformation, more often than not, doesn't happen in isolation. Number 5. Jon Voight. Before the fame, before the headlines, before Angelina Jolie became a name, the entire world recognized there was a relationship that had already begun to define how she would see everything that followed. Jon Voight was not just her father. He was an Academy Award-winning actor, a respected figure in Hollywood, and from the outside, someone who should have been a guiding presence in her life. But what looked solid in public often felt distant in private. As Angelina grew up, that distance didn't simply fade away. It deepened. The kind of distance that doesn't always come from one dramatic moment, but from years of things left unsaid. When she eventually stepped into the same industry, comparisons were unavoidable. The press framed it as legacy, a continuation of something already established. But for Angelina, it never felt that simple. Their relationship began to play out in ways that were unusually public for something so personal. Interviews replaced conversations. Statements were made indirectly, sometimes through the media, sometimes through silence that carried just as much weight. And then came the moment that made everything undeniable. She chose to legally remove Voight from her name. That decision wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate. A clear signal that whatever connection remained between them, it was no longer something she wanted to define her identity. But the story doesn't end there. He don't know vitably sad. People just formetter common. He don't know vitably said, formetter common better. He don't know vitably said, formetter. Because even when people separate, the influence doesn't disappear. If anything, it becomes quieter, and sometimes more powerful. When you look at Angelina Jolie's later relationships, the intensity, the speed, the emotional depth that often seem to appear almost instantly, there's a pattern that begins to emerge. It's as if connection was never something she approached halfway. It was always everything or nothing. And that kind of approach rarely comes without a history behind it. Over the years, there were moments when it seemed like reconciliation might be possible. Brief periods where the tension softened, where the past felt like it might finally loosen its hold. But history has a way of staying present, even when people try to move forward. Because some relationships don't simply end. They become part of the foundation. And the question that lingers isn't whether Jon Voight was there or not. It's whether his absence at the moments that mattered most shaped the way Angelina Jolie would spend the rest of her life searching for something that always felt just out of reach. Number 4. Brad Pitt. It didn't begin as a scandal. It began as something far more subtle, a connection that seemed almost too natural to question. When Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt came together on the set of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, it looked at first like nothing more than two highly skilled actors doing their job. But there was a difference that people could feel even before they could explain it. The tension between them didn't look scripted. The chemistry didn't feel manufactured. And that's exactly why everything that followed became impossible to ignore. At the time, Brad Pitt was still married to Jennifer Aniston, a figure many saw as the embodiment of stability in Hollywood, which meant that when rumors began to surface, they didn't just spark curiosity, they triggered something much larger. Suddenly, this wasn't just about a film. It became a story the public felt emotionally invested in. Lines were drawn. Opinions were formed. And Angelina Jolie found herself cast into a narrative that went far beyond anything she had chosen on screen. But what made this relationship different from the ones before it was what came next. They didn't retreat. They didn't disappear from the spotlight. Instead, they built something that looked for a time almost unbreakable. A family that grew in front of the world. A partnership that extended beyond film into humanitarian work, global attention, and a kind of influence that very few couples had ever achieved. For years, they weren't just followed, they were studied. Every appearance, every decision, every shift in body language became part of a larger conversation about who they were and what they represented. And that's what made the unraveling so difficult to look away from. When the relationship began to fracture, it didn't happen quietly. The separation quickly became public, and with it came details that reshaped how people saw both of them. Allegations, custody battles, and conflicting narratives turned what had once been an ideal into something far more complicated. The same connection that had once seemed effortless now appeared fragile under pressure. And in the middle of it all was Angelina Jolie, once again navigating a situation where the personal became public before it could be fully understood. Because Brad Pitt wasn't just another relationship in her life. He was the one that defined an entire era, the one that changed how the world saw her perhaps more than any role she had ever played. And even now, long after the headlines have faded, the question remains, was this the relationship that gave her everything, or the one that forced her to confront everything she had been trying not to see? Number 3. Harvey Weinstein. This wasn't a relationship anyone would describe as personal in the traditional sense. There were no red carpets together, no public declarations, no carefully framed photographs. And yet the influence was undeniable, because it revealed something about Hollywood that many people only understood much later. When Angelina Jolie was still building her career, still finding her place in an industry that rewards both talent and compliance, she encountered Harvey Weinstein. At the time, he wasn't just a producer. He was a gatekeeper, the kind of figure whose approval could open doors that would otherwise remain closed. For many, crossing paths with someone like him was seen as an opportunity, but for Angelina, it became something else entirely. Years later, when she spoke about her experience, she didn't describe it with dramatics or elaborate detail. In fact, what stood out most was how direct and controlled her words were. She simply made it clear that it was an experience she did not want to repeat, and that she chose from that point forward to never work with him again. That decision, when viewed in isolation, might seem straightforward. But placed in the context of Hollywood at the time, it carried a different kind of weight, because walking away from someone with that level of influence wasn't without consequence. It meant choosing uncertainty over opportunity, silence over compromise. And perhaps most importantly, it meant trusting that her career could survive without the backing of one of the most powerful men in the industry. What makes this moment even more significant is what came later. When the full scope of allegations against Weinstein eventually surfaced, the conversation around him shifted overnight. Stories that had once been dismissed or ignored were suddenly taken seriously. And Angelina Jolie's earlier decision began to look less like a personal boundary and more like an early recognition of something deeply wrong. But this part of her story isn't about placing her at the center of that scandal. It's about understanding proximity, about recognizing that sometimes the most defining influences in a person's life come from the moments where they are forced to choose how much they are willing to tolerate and what they are willing to walk away from. In this case, Angelina chose distance. But distance doesn't erase the experience. It simply reshapes it into something quieter, something internal, something that continues to influence decisions long after the moment itself has passed. And that raises a question that doesn't have an easy answer. How many paths in her career were changed? Not by what she chose to pursue, but by what she chose to refuse. Number 2. James Haven. There are moments in Hollywood that fade as quickly as they appear. And then there are moments that refuse to disappear, no matter how much time passes. This was one of them. When Angelina Jolie walked onto the stage at the Academy Awards in 2000, she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was her brother, James Haven, someone who until that point had remained largely outside the public spotlight. What followed should have been remembered only as a celebration. She had just won an Oscar, a defining moment in any actor's career. But that's not what people focused on. It was the kiss, brief, unexpected, and instantly magnified by the cameras that captured it from every angle. Within hours, it became the image everyone was talking about. Within days, it became something else entirely. A question that people couldn't stop asking. Was it simply a moment of affection taken out of context and misunderstood? Or was it something that crossed an invisible boundary the public wasn't prepared to accept? What made the situation more complex was how quickly perception took control of the narrative. There was no immediate detailed explanation to guide how people should interpret what they saw. Instead, the moment existed on its own, replayed over and over again, each time inviting a new interpretation. And once a moment like that enters the public consciousness, it doesn't just go away, it evolves. It becomes part of the story people tell about you, whether it reflects reality or not. For Angelina Jolie, this wasn't about a relationship in the traditional sense. It was about how fragile public image can be, how one moment removed from its full context can redefine how millions of people see you. And perhaps more importantly, how difficult it is to regain control of that narrative once it's been shaped by others. Over time, the intensity of the reaction faded, as most headlines eventually do. But the imprint of that moment remained. Not always visible, not always discussed, but present enough to resurface whenever her name was brought into conversations about controversy or unpredictability. Because sometimes the most powerful influences in a person's life aren't defined by duration or depth. They're defined by impact, and in this case the impact wasn't just personal, it was public. It was immediate. And it was something neither Angelina Jolie nor James Haven could fully take back once the world had decided what it meant. Number 1. Billy Bob Thornton. Before the world began to see Angelina Jolie as a humanitarian, before the carefully composed public image took shape, there was a period in her life that felt almost impossible to contain. And at the center of that period stood Billy Bob Thornton. This wasn't a relationship that unfolded slowly or predictably. It appeared suddenly with an intensity that immediately set it apart from everything around it. When they married, it wasn't framed as a fairy tale. It felt more like a moment of impulse. A decision driven by something deeper than logic. And from the very beginning, the way they expressed their connection challenged what people expected to see. Public gestures that seemed unusual, even uncomfortable to some. A closeness that didn't follow familiar patterns. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't meant to be. For Angelina, this was a time when she didn't just resist expectations. She rejected them entirely. And Billy Bob Thornton wasn't trying to balance that energy. He mirrored it. He existed within it. That's what made their relationship so compelling, but also so fragile. Because when intensity becomes the foundation, stability often disappears. And without stability, even the strongest connection can begin to collapse under its own weight. When it ended quickly. There wasn't a long public unraveling, no extended explanation that allowed people to make sense of what had happened. Just distance, silence, and the quiet understanding that something powerful had come to an end. But what makes Billy Bob Thornton the final name on this list isn't how the relationship ended. It's what it revealed. In that period of her life, Angelina Jolie showed a version of herself that was raw, unpredictable, and almost impossible to define. A version that didn't seek approval, didn't adjust to expectations, and didn't attempt to make sense to anyone watching from the outside. And once a person reveals that side of themselves, it doesn't simply disappear. It becomes part of who they are, even if it's no longer visible. That's why this relationship lingers in a different way. Not because of the headlines, not because of the shock value, but because it represents a version of Angelina Jolie that the world rarely sees anymore. And the question that remains isn't just about what happened between them. It's whether that version of her was ever truly left behind, or if it still exists, quietly shaping the choices she makes long after the world has moved on. Now, when people look at Angelina Jolie today, they see control. They see purpose. They see someone who has carefully built a life that appears far removed from the chaos that once surrounded her. The humanitarian work, the directing, the quiet presence in interviews. It all suggests a woman who has found balance after years of intensity. But if you step back and look at the full picture, the story becomes harder to simplify. Because each of these men didn't just pass through her life as isolated chapters. They shaped transitions. They marked moments where something changed, sometimes subtly, sometimes all at once. And what makes Angelina Jolie's journey so compelling isn't just the transformation itself. It's how often that transformation seemed to be triggered by connection, conflict, or the decision to walk away. One relationship ends, and a new version of her appears. One chapter closes, and the world is introduced to someone who feels almost entirely different. But are those versions truly separate, or are they all still there, layered beneath the surface, influencing the choices she continues to make? That's the question that doesn't have a clear answer. Because no matter how much someone evolves, no matter how far they move from their past, the people who shaped them don't simply disappear. They become part of the foundation. And maybe that's why Angelina Jolie continues to fascinate audiences after all these years. Not because of what she chooses to show the world, but because of what remains, just out of reach. Because somewhere between the past and the present, between the headlines and the silence, there's still a part of her story that hasn't fully been told. And the truth is, it may never be.